And this week here on Mastering Dungeons, we are going to talk about the Monster Manual and the previews that have been done by Wizards of the Coast and what we think about monster design in general as we wait with bated breath for the release of the 2024 Monster Manual. So, Teos, what has Wizards of the Coast been doing to prepare here?
Yeah, so like as they did with the Monster Man or with the Player's Handbook and somewhat with the Dungeon Master's Guide, they have a series of videos that they're going to provide out as sort of live quote unquote feeds. They're pre-recorded, but fans can join in and watch them as they happen and all be in chat and that kind of thing. The first video was on Tuesday, an overview of the changes and design approach provided by Jeremy Crawford and Wes Schneider. They both say their favorite books are monster books, and so let me ask you, I'll talk about kind of what the video said. I want to ask you questions. Are monster books your favorite?
No, they're not. They are wonderful,
Mm-hmm.
and they become my favorite after I have worked on the rules
Mm.
because they are a natural extension of that.
Mm-hmm.
And they are important. They may be the most important book
Mm.
because games run on the back of Game Masters, and the
Mm.
monsters are the chess piece. They are the pawn.
Yeah.
They are the thing that gets put on the table that the game masters can control. So the best way to ruin a really good game is to make not great monsters that dissuade or discourage or disincentivize
Mm.
the game masters from wanting to engage with the game. If it's a fantasy role-playing D&D type game, obviously.
Right, right. No, but that's a great point. That I can think of RPGs where I don't super love the monster side of things, and that does impact how I feel about the overall game. Huh. I would say on my end, I've only worked on individual monsters, never a whole monster book the way that you have. I'm holding the Grim Hollow monster
Monster
book,
Grimoire.
Monster Grimoire. This is your baby. I can't imagine that. What I know from speaking to others, you and other friends of mine, is it's really easy to uh, skim over, to think that monster books are easy. Like just collect a monster, it's stat books, it's lore. But it actually requires a ton of planning because the layout is tough. You don't want to go over a page. If you do, you don't want to be on the other side of the page. You want to somehow have a very legible stat block that is super exciting, but also all this lore. And you need art for possibly every single monster in the book, which makes it one of the most expensive things you can create. Am I missing anything?
No, that's you hit the nail so hard on the head that I'm my ears are ringing. Uh Martin, our layout guru, who listens to the show, hey Martin. Um the Monster Grimoire was the first book that I led
Hmm.
production of. And Martin did not kill me, and I appreciate that, because we were constantly having to adjust things. He did, great in getting everything where it needed to be, but there were still times when it would be like, okay, we need to change the name of this monster. I'm like, why do we need to change the name of the monster? Because we're making the book alphabetical and we have a single page that's orphaned. So we need to change the name of a monster and move it into somewhere between LI, right, and LU. And I'm like, okay, LO. So we're gonna have a monster named Lo. That's how silly uh making a monster book is.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So Jeremy and Wes talked about a number of interesting things, and I'll hit on the things that kind of I thought we could mention. So one is they talk about the team. I think it was Wes who went into this. They work to describe monsters in the world, not just as static monsters to fight. And that part wasn't super wild to me. Actually, the wild thing was Todd Kenreck said something, who's ostensibly the interviewer, but at times expresses design thoughts. makes the strange comment that this is the first edition to do that. And I immediately thought of like second edition being full of these ecology entries and number of appearing and things like that. And some of that goes back to first edition. There have been a number of world focused pieces that we've seen, fourth edition, and like, think of Nentier Vale's Monster Manual, all this. So I thought it was a very strange comment, but the team seemed to pride itself on having, as compared to 2014 at least, done more work to paint how the monsters work within the world. What do you think of that?
I think it's problematic. I'm gonna throw myself into the hot
Yeah.
water here. It's problematic because you want, again, you want game masters to love these books. But what most game masters need is a fun monster to, at the table, challenge and surprise your players with.
Mm.
By trying to put every monster in a place in the world, you're actually narrowing what game masters can do. And you run the
Mm.
risk of quote unquote humanizing the monsters to the point where you no longer want to use them as what they are made for, which is in D&D, beating on and taking their treasure. And telling good stories with. Telling good stories with. But they need to be antagonists in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is this need for empathy in the world. There's no doubt, right?
Mm-hmm.
We need to understand things better. But a game is not life. And so we always run this risk of overbuilding these things that have a very specific need in the game. So it's not bad to do. It can just be, if you overextend yourself, work that doesn't pay off the way you think it might.
Right.
Does
it might
that
be
make
actually,
sense?
yeah, because you could be limiting things versus actually adding to it, because now you said it's this, not these other ideas you may have. It's just these. Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking about it because I think fondly of the 13th Age 1E, because I don't have 2E yet in physical form. The 1E 13th Age, both the bestiary book, which I'm holding, and the core book itself with its monsters, has some really nice things that I like. And I remember it came out, I think, just a little bit before or after. It was similar in timescale to when 2014's Monster Manual came out. I think a little bit before. And I remember liking both of them, finding they did a nice job of giving me story and ideas, lore, concepts that I could play upon. And then in looking at 13th Age 2E, it does a lot of things that are definitely about making it useful at the table, right? Special things you can do. They have, how to make them special monsters that are different than the core. There's a lot of toolbox approach to it, with then interspersed, some of the monsters have a lot of like, here's how they fit into the world, but not all of them.
Right.
And I actually thought to myself, this might actually be better. Like, not, and it was, I wasn't sure what you would say. You kind of seemed to be on the same side of like, some monsters actually, maybe we just focus on these things as tools in the game rather than fleshing everything out, because you can think of those concepts, maybe, or at least not every monster necessarily needs the same approach.
Right. Having a place in the world is fine. It's just make their place in the world something that enhances the story of what the characters are going up against, as opposed to what we did with the space we had in the Monster Grimoire, was use, rather than having big, long mythological or sociological or historical where these monsters fit, is if you kill this monster and use its brain, you can make these things, because that's what players want to do, right?
Sure.
When the players kill this strange creature, they don't know. Now tell me about its history, right? They're like, okay, what do we do now? Oh, you could do this, or use that yours that space that you have, that limited space, as Teos said,
Mm-hmm.
to put in things that characters can interact with, like lore that's specific to that creature as the players are interacting with it. Oh, this thing has a strange horn that glows out of its head. What's the DC Arcana check so I can figure out what that horn does while I am fighting this creature, or what can I do after with that horn, right? That's
Mm.
what a player is generally going to be interested in.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, They again talked here about all new art. But what I thought interesting was about this. Every book has made the claim. Every core book for 2025 and 2024 has made this claim of all new art. And then we found there's been some old art. So I expect the same here. But they emphasized the all new art. But what they did was talk about D&D specific situations. And
Mhm.
they didn't quite say it this way, so I'll say it my way. So be aware these are kind of my words, not theirs. But D&D is no longer the only way you learn about a mimic, let alone a
Mhm.
creature from myth, right? Like some folks would say, well, I saw Medusa in D&D before I ever, you know, read Edith Hamilton or,
Mhm.
saw Clash of the Titans or anything like that. And now you could have somebody who learns about a mimic through the Delicious Dungeon Netflix show rather than, D&D. So I thought this was actually kind of really interesting, and I hadn't really thought about this way, that providing the art thinking of the art as being, we must show what the D&D version is like and what this
Mhm.
D&D monster is like in the world, because you may have ideas about ogres from, I don't know, Shrek, you know,
Mhm.
and
Right.
what is a D&D ogre? Which again, like you said, does put some limits in it.
Mhm.
But in this case, it may be important to do because someone might think a mimic is an entirely different thing. And so showing, and in their case, they talked about, the art which they showed off shows a ton of different types of mimics, right? A sort of room full of things that are all mimics.
Yeah. And that's why art can be so important in general, and why it's super important in this D&D book, because when you're searching as the game master for a story, the first thing you're going to see is the art. So
Mm-hmm.
you need to have that context right away of, okay, vampire, as you say, is it a sparkly vampire? Is it
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So if I look, and if I go to the Monster Grimoire and I flip through, and in the back, not only do I see vampire, but I see bugbear vampire and elf vampire and dwarf vampire, and none of them look inviting, right? None of them look like someone you'd want to sit down and have a cup of tea with. So right then you know that, okay, these are the enemies. This is not one of those, oh, vampires are cool, friendly, just misunderstood folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. Um, yeah. I think that's a really interesting, that D&D may kind of it need to do this more and more over time to exert what its
Mm.
version of it is. What I thought was super interesting. The way that I think for other books, like, or other companies, they show why theirs is a little different than the D&D one,
Mm.
right? So, and here you've got to establish what the core is.
Yeah.
Um, Something else they brought up. This is something that came up during Monsters of the Multiverse, and apparently has continued on. Is that in 2024, any path you take, so whichever actions you choose for the monster, will reflect the monster's CR, not just the most optimal approach. And there had been a sort of, I thought, terribly worded article a long time ago where Jeremy Crawford kind of said, we've realized DMs make mistakes and don't run our monsters the way they should. So that's why Monsters of the Multiverse is going to sort of make this all equated. Um,
Mhm.
Here they talked about it in a much nicer way, about just saying that, no matter what path you take, you'll arrive at the CR.
Mhm.
And I credit Mike Shea on this, because he had Jeremy Crawford on a show long ago and asked him why one of the Eladrin had such weak options for the weapon attacks. It does 4 damage and it's a CR10 monster. And, Jeremy Crawford was like, well, they don't really, it's just showing what the monster can do, but they wouldn't do that. They would use their, cone of cold or ice storm. And what I thought about in the context of 2025's Monster Manual, whether what they've done, because they didn't quite state what they've done, does it mean that no matter what you do, the math target will be pretty much the same? So if CRX is, supposed to be an average of blah, does that mean all paths lead to blah? Or is the approach more flexible? Like CRX can be between, A and B levels of damage. Or maybe we don't care about spikes of damage. And as long as most options lead to this, then having one that's really high or really low, we don't particularly care about. I'm curious to what extent they've done this. So I can't wait to see what the monster has actually done. And how do you feel about this, having worked on monsters? Like, how important is it for a monster to kind of have all paths lead to, mathematical answer X?
I think the important thing is that as a designer of monsters, you recognize how game masters use monsters. And they use them very differently depending on the kind of game they run. So I'm running a game at a convention, and I know that the party is super optimized. Then I am going to take the time to look up Cone of Cold. I'm going to take the time to position it at its best possible angle. And I'm going to take the time to have everyone roll the save, take the time to roll all the dice and add them up, because that's what the party seems to want. I'm running a home game with a little looser set of people. I don't want a monster that only does a D4 of physical fighting damage at CR10, because I don't want to take the time to do all of that. I just want to do the thing that makes the story the most fun. So I think when I was designing and developing and editing monsters, I tried to find that place where you want to do the quick and simple thing. It's there and it's right. I did get a few monsters wrong, I will admit. Wrong in the sense that they do rely on a spell list, right? They do rely on the game master doing a couple of different things to get them in the right position to do their thing. But that is also just part of the game. And that's why I've always been a fan of, in a monster manual, get rid of the spell list. And just write out that, okay, this thing does, right? It's either the save, or better yet, give me an attack roll. Right. Let me just do the attack roll. Let me do the damage, and we'll move on, instead of having to figure out the area of effect and everybody in the right position in a game that you're not supposed to need a map to play. Right. Let's simplify it a bit for those DMs who just want to tell the story and want things to move along.
This brings up the question of how important it is for monsters to have various actions, because on one hand, depending on kind of who you listen to, a monster should last 3, 4, 5 rounds, and DMs will all have their own opinion of what their average is at their table, and sometimes it'll be 8 rounds, right? But if you hit for a certain target, like monster should last 3 rounds, well, they certainly shouldn't have more than 3 options, is one way of looking at it. Or actually, they should have a lot of options, because I want to pick and choose the tactics of my options, right? But tempered by the fact that, well, if 3 or 4 is the average, then as I get above 4, things are going unused, and that's prep time and complexity and so on. So I'm curious to what extent we'll find that these monsters have fewer options, or that it's all captured in a multi-attack. For example, you throw your spear and you attack with your sword twice, but that's kind of what you do. And maybe there's one other little thing that you can do to juice it up. And that might be okay, but you do lose a little expression from having more options out there, right? Or if the spellcasting list, what is it supposed to represent? And should it have, say, just 2 choices? Is that good or is that bad design? It
Right.
sure minimizes prep, and I love that angle of it, but
Mhm.
maybe there should be more. I don't, it's a tough question.
Yeah, it's my first response is get rid of the spell list. Anything that is in the spell list can be written as an action, a bonus action, or a reaction.
Yeah.
So just list them there and tell me what they do. And
Yeah.
of course, you can't then counterspell. I know.
But you
Let's
could
get
say this is a spell. You could if you want
right.
to.
You still could absolutely say
Parentheses
that, but
spell. Yeah.
yeah, get counterspell out of the game completely and just let things happen.
Yeah.
Um, but it's fine to have those options, but
Mhm.
again, you don't want to overload a monster
Yeah.
with too much. But I like that maybe give every monster a couple of actions, a reaction, and maybe a bonus action.
Yeah.
And that's something that DMs already understand because it's part of the game.
Hmm.
And I'm not one for making monster equal PC.
Right. Right.
I think they should be different, and I like games where they're completely different. Uh, but we already have that rhythm down.
Yeah.
So we are, and we're getting more and more bonus actions and more reactions on the player side. So we're going to get more and more used to it in 2024. So I think it's okay if we see some of those things sneak into monsters because there are very few monsters, relatively speaking, in the 2014 that have like reactions,
Right.
bonus actions.
Right.
Uh, so if you are going to expand and you are going to give more options, put them there. So rather than
Mm.
picking from 12 actions, I
Mm.
can only do one. Don't give me 12 when two of them are obviously
Yeah.
best. Just give me those two, and then let me do something fun as a bonus action
Yeah.
or as a reaction.
Well, and I love that about fourth edition where they would give monsters these iconic things, right? The goblin was shifty and it could always,
Yep.
use a minor action to, move away without provoking, right? And that kind of thing became a tell that all the goblins could do. And it was fun because the players would learn that and expect that, right? And then, yeah. And we see some of that, right? Wolves that have pack tactics and some things like that. And so you see, oh, yeah, this kind of creature tends to get pack tactics, but there's not a lot of it. It'll be interesting to see how that happens. So one of the things that they did early on was say, what's changed? And the answer was everything, right? Everything is new. Um, and they have the most that, but what they said later to kind of qualify that of what has changed, because basically the blanket answer is all monsters have changed,
Mhm.
which is something we saw in the other books, right? I thought 2024 would have some chapters of the DMG of their player's handbook that would pretty much be what they were before because they were great.
Mhm.
No, things got
Mhm.
changed even if everybody loved them, right? Everybody loved the rogue still changed, right? And everybody might have loved how something else worked. Well, it got changed. And this seems to be more of that. They said most monsters have a tweaked ability or a new thing, but as the CR increases, we can expect the
Mhm.
monster to receive more and more changes.
Mhm.
They also said there are many more types. So the vampire is now what they call a family of creatures. I don't know if
Mhm.
that's a technical term or just Jeremy Crawford's word for it, but the vampire now has a low CR option, a high one,
Mhm.
a middle one, and the vampire spawn. And I wasn't clear whether that was in addition to what we consider today as vampire or not, but there's at least four of them, maybe five,
Right.
right?
Yeah. And that's they're learning from other publishers.
Or fourth
When
edition.
or fourth edition or yeah or everything. Well, I mean, it makes sense to do that because you can tell stories at
Mm-hmm.
any point, any tier.
Yeah.
If you do that, it's also easier to put in a stat block that doesn't need new art
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
say, oh, goblin. Well, we have the one goblin picture. Now there's these five different goblins.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
vampires. We have this one vampire picture. Here are six different stat blocks that do the vampire. So just in terms of creating a physical book, it's easier to do that as well. And I think DMs like that.
Yeah,
I
I
think
think so
DMs
too.
like that ability.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah.
They mentioned various type changes. So gnolls are now fiends, which I can't help but wonder if that's just so we can slaughter them without thinking about it.
Mhm.
Goblinoids are fae, which we saw in Witchlight. And there have been, I think, previous times in goblins were fae as well. And of course, they come from fae origins in our mythology. They said the goblin hexer is back from 4E, which probably was the only time in that video that they acknowledged 4th edition as an influence, though to me, all of these things they were talking about have super 4E angles to them.
Sure.
They have a lower CR variant now, right? Which is, as you talked about, it's a very different thought process. 2014 had this idea that a goblin is a goblin is a goblin, and it's just this thing in the world, and it's always at that CR. And so, if you want more of them, well, then it's a different type of story you're telling, right? Because that's what it means to have multiples of them. And here they were specifically talking about having, some DMs really love having a bunch of goblins for their characters to encounter. So here we have these lower CRs, so you can do that.
Mhm.
And that is what 4th edition did. And so it's fun to watch the pendulum kind of swing back and forth.
Yeah. You know, fourth edition had minions,
Mm-hmm.
and I think game masters like that. Rules wise, yes, it could be problematic, but for the most part, we love throwing a big pile of things.
Yeah.
And what did MCDM do with
Yep.
their monster book? They
Yeah.
did as much mining of fourth edition as they could to bring that sort of feel back. And now Wizards of the Coast learned from that and
Yeah.
are yep,
And I'm looking
there
at
you go.
one ring here where they have, for orcs, the Great Orc Chief, the Great Orc Bodyguard. They have, Orc Guard, Goblin Archer, Orc Chief, and Orc Soldier, right? A lot of these different varieties and trolls as well. There's not just the cave troll, but, all number of subvariants and so on. Uh, so it's something I think that a lot of RPGs recognize as a fun way to change things up and to have more flexibility around the stories you're telling, right?
Right. The stories and the tactics.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's nothing, if I could take an orc, make that orc the leader, and then just put guards or bandits around them and say they're orcs, great, I could do that. But there's nothing different to the feel of the
Mm-hmm.
fight than it would be if it was a human
Right.
with bandits and guards, except that the orc can probably do one thing different. So having there be synergy in these things, that sort of synergy is a way to do what we had talked about in the first segment of the show, right?
Yep.
Which is show a story, not the first segment, but earlier in this segment, to have that story be there, but have it be there in a way that the players can see in action,
Yeah.
as opposed to have some esoteric mythology or
Mm-hmm.
history behind
Mm-hmm.
it all.
Yeah. Yeah. And that action it makes a big difference. I mean, I remember any number of 4th edition fights where, you drop in a particular variant and everybody goes, oh, it's doing
Mhm.
what? And
Yeah,
that
yeah.
makes it a really fun dynamic fight. They mentioned that the organization is the recent push they've had for a true alphabetical order, not by types such as giant or devils. So, if you're looking at bugbears are under B and a Chasme would be under C, not under devil and so on.
Hmm.
So that's all, I guess a cloud giant will be under C, right? And there's good and bad to that, right? I mean, I thought the 2014 way it did giants and told us about the Ordling and all that was really very useful. So I don't know, do we lose all that? Maybe, maybe that's one of the ways they squeeze some space out. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
I I think it goes back to what I just said. If making giants a thing culturally, sociologically, historically, you want to put them together. You don't want to have cloud giant under C and fire giant under F and then having to go back and forth if you are running an adventure where the giants are important.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah.
then again, if you just want monsters to fit on their own, then that can be easier to find.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They talked about more monsters that use bloodied as a trigger, which is interesting because we saw a ton of that in fourth edition. Bloodied showed up in the Player's Handbook 2024, so we'll apparently see more that talks about that. They also said or inflict exhaustion since we've changed the exhaustion rules, and I thought, oh, I can see Shawn's face right now.
Yeah, you are not going to make a lot of players happy
Yeah.
with that, but okay.
-2, -4, -6.
Yeah, yeah. First level of exhaustion, okay. We can get around that. Second level, when you're dealing with -4s, players are
Yeah.
going to revolt.
Mm-hmm. Spellcasters will use some of the new 2024 spells, which is not a huge surprise. They talked about more monsters that are thought of as spellcasters will have some form of spellcasting block, such as most of the older dragons. History has often said that they can cast spells and had different ways that represented that. So here they will have spellcasting blocks. Apparently not the white dragon, because it's Jeremy made some joke like still learning how spellcasting works or something like that. Okay, or
All right.
or icy dragon.
Mm-hmm.
They mentioned specific monsters that have updates, like the Tarask no longer has to worry about people fighting at just a range. A number of species have art that depicts two genders. So dryad, hags, satyrs, the succubus and incubus are now two different creatures, and each have art depicting both genders representing them. And then the usual thing, I kind of just close with this, somewhat for fun. It's the biggest monster manual ever, Shawn. Once again, yes. Well, we have larger font and we have more art, and over 80 monsters are being added. That makes me think to myself, well, what did you take out? Because somehow, when you have larger font and more art, you can't do it. Even when you add pages, it's just so hard. Like just increasing font and art will automatically be a massive page count, right? So are there shorter descriptions? Are the stat blocks leaner? I'm very curious to see what will have changed to make this all work. Because just as we talked about with the layout of monsters, an individual monster usually fitting on a page, sometimes two, that's your layout to work with. If your font and your art got bigger or more plentiful, what are you doing? Something has to go away. So I'm very curious, and folks may think we're just kidding about this, but just last episode, I made a joke about the 2025 MM being bigger as I am today. And since then, I had a friend who gave me the size of the DMG. So here you go. The 2014 DMG had 197,000 words. Okay, almost 200,000, 197. The 2024 DMG has 188K words. Bigger, more art.
Just longer words, Teos. It's just longer words. That's all. They use longer words.
That's all. Yeah. So, right. You did lose some words in the DMG. It's actually pretty close, right? It's just, what is that, 9,000 words difference that you lost? But, the monster manual, I'm curious whether, somehow we can, it's a lot harder to do the word count for stat blocks like that. But I'm curious as to what it'll look like. It's probably easier to just compare like a single page of common monsters and see how it has changed. But especially if you think about something like the goblin, if it's going to have 3 variants of the vampire, something's got to go, right? We have heard that every monster that is in 2014 is in 2024. I think I remember someone saying that. So we're not losing monsters, but somewhere the words have to come out of to make up for all that.
It's true. Well, you can see all of the stuff that we talked about on the YouTube channel for D&D. We have a link to that in our show notes. So we have covered monsters, and now we are going to talk about the heroes, the true heroes here, which are our listeners. Thank you so much for listening. We do run a Patreon to help us keep the lights on here. We have people who support us there. We have Master of Dungeon supporters. Thank you so much. Master of Realm supporters. I'm looking at your names right now in our show notes. A lot of wonderful people there. And our Masters of the Multiverse, which back us at our highest level, they get a shout out in our show notes. And you know what? I liked last year how we alternated. So this time you go first.
All right. Here we go. Let me get to my
Uh,
list.
I'll go first. Agile Monk of Fantasy Companion Workshops.
Keith Aman of The Monsters Know What They're Doing.
Lou Anders of Lazy Wolf Studios.
Craig Bailey.
David Bastianson.
Steve Bissonette.
Merrick Blackman.
Calvin Bridges Avalos.
Evil John.
Evan at Nimble Company.
Guardian published writer Will Doyle.
Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon.com.
James Fisher.
Scott Fitzgerald Gray at Insane Angel Studios.
William Harshman of Runeforged Tabletop Gaming.
Ben Heisler and Paige Laitman.
Sean Hurst.
Mark and Mary's Gaming Compound.
The Mighty Jerd.
JR of The Twilight Perspective.
Brian King.
Jim Klingler, aka DM Prime Mover.
Chad Lynch.
Paul Mata.
The Mathemagician.
Eric Mengi.
Anna B. Meyer of Fantasy Cartography.
Trey McLemore.
John Mickey.
Sean Molly.
Falcon Neal.
Tom Nelson of The Deck of Player Safety.
Mighty Zeus.
Bill Wirt from the Philadelphia Area Gaming Expo.
Frog Prince at Tentacles Squelching Wetly.
Post Fiction RPG Audio.
Robert Pasley.
Vladimir Prenner from Croatia.
Pugnus.
Ozymandias Rex.
Runner Rick.
Chance Russo at Drago Russo.
Andy Shockney.
Krishna Simon Siri.
Spark from Dunnar Games.
Josh and Lee Wanika of the Tabletop Journeys podcast.
Talos the Stormlord.
Jeremy Taloman from the D&D and TV podcast.
Trace.
Joe Tyler.
Marcelo de Velasquez, the Valiant DM, not the mighty. He is mighty, but he is also valiant.
James Walton.
Graham Ward.
Jason Ward from Accidental Cyclops Games.
Javier Waziak.
Chris Webster.
Zach Types.
And Z. Walt Winfrey.
Thank you to all our listeners and all our patrons. If you do like this show and you listen regularly, please do consider supporting the Patreon at patreon.com/masteringdnd. That gives you access to our Discord server where some amazing conversations happen. Also, you can leave us a review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to this podcast. And you can also subscribe on YouTube if you want to see all of this. So, what you been up to?
What have I been up to? I have a video coming out soon that will be going through some topics I've had on my blog around getting started with campaigns with various role-playing games, how to pick through them.
Nice. I can't wait to see that. You can find me on the socials at Sean Merwin. You can follow Teos at alphastream.org. You can follow the show at Mastering D&D on the socials. We have our Patreon. We have our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@masteringdungeons. So we have discussed what we know or what we have learned about the new monster manual. What should we do now?
I'm going to turn to the secret page in the monster manual they haven't talked about yet, where you find out that the real monster is you.
I am going to go make a real monster. Me.